We're starting this afternoon with a reflection on practice to talk about online teaching. And we are very fortunate to have with us Carol Tilley from the library, the School of Library and Information Science. It's her work in synchronous online, working with synchronous classes goes way back from to Indiana when she started teaching online in Indiana. So she was sharing with me that she has been teaching online for almost 17 years now. So she has a lot of experience of what to do in synchronous classes. And I am very glad that she's willing to share her experience with us today. The plan for today is Carol is going to tell us her story and her work and how she manages these synchronous classes. And we have also distributed, if you didn't get it yet, we have one handout like this, that the purpose of this is what the purpose of our meetings is, just to reflect on what we do in the classes. And I wonder how many of you are teaching online? Okay. Great. The idea is that if you are teaching online, is that you use these handouts to think about what you do in your synchronous session. We have a few questions. We're going to work with the first two. The first two questions are for you to think now, and then after Carol gives her presentation, we're going to have some questions for her, and then again, reflect on your own practice, and then we're going to discuss your own reflections. So I will read a little bit of Carol's biography, and then I will give the microphone to Carol. Carol teaches courses in comic readers advisory, media literacy, and youth services librarianship. And I do recommend Google Carol. There are wonderful things that she does with comics. Part of her scholarship focuses on the intersection of young people, comics, and library, particularly in the United States in the mid-20th century. Her research has been published in journals, including the Journal of American Society for Information Science and Technology. Her research on anti-comic advocates, Frederick Wertman, was featured in the New York Times and other media outlets. Thank you, Carol, for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm hoping that my mic level is okay. Great. So as Norma mentioned, I've been teaching distance courses for a very long time, and I want to share a little bit about my work, some tips. I don't claim that anything I have to share with you today is particularly novel or maybe even best practice, but it's something that these are all things that work for me. They are practices that I'm continually evolving. So I want to start out a little bit about me, my experience with teaching online. I've been at Illinois since 2007, and before that I had a much too long doctoral tenure at Indiana, where I was also teaching full-time as a lecturer. I taught primarily distance courses there in a variety of formats. So as Norma mentioned, I've been teaching distance courses since 1997, and I took distance courses even before that. My first experience was taking correspondence courses as an undergrad, which is still an effective technology, depending. But when I started teaching distance courses at Indiana, we were using a locally developed system called Virtual Indiana Classroom that started out, it was a video conferencing system. We had students who would arrive at anywhere between 4 and 6 sites somewhere in the state of Indiana. I had students in the room with me, and it was one-way video beginning and two-way audio. And then we changed to two-way video and two-way audio. It kept getting more fascinating and complex over time. But I got very adept with camera control and making slides to use on a document camera and supporting students that way. Here at Illinois, we've gone through 2 systems. When I started at GSLIS, we were using a local system And we have switched now to using Blackboard Collaborate. And that has been quite a revelation in terms of my practice in distance teaching. It has been the platform that has allowed me to have the closest thing to a face-to-face class that I've experienced so far. I have some background in cognition and instruction. As a doctoral student, I have a doctoral minor in that, so I've thought about these issues from that perspective as well. At Indiana, I also, for 7 years, was director of distance education for the library schools program at Indianapolis. So we did all of the distance education program. We had about 300 students in that. I did advising and faculty support and faculty development, that kind of thing. So I've worn a lot of hats in that. But my approach, quite simply, is I think a design-based approach when I think about what I want to do in an online classroom. I am a big advocate of being purposeful and intentional, of thinking very clearly about content. And content, I mean broadly in terms of the conceptual knowledge-based content, but content also in terms of activities. I very much want to think, as I put together my synchronous sessions, how I want students to be different at the end. And it's the same conversation I have with myself when I teach a face-to-face class. So each semester here, I typically teach one face-to-face class and one distance class. And sometimes, such as in the fall semester typically, it's the same course taught in two different modalities. And that's a little bit challenging. The way we handle distance courses at GISLIS is that we meet for 2 hours a week instead of 2 hours and 50 minutes. And then we have all of our students come to campus for a full day each semester. In fact, yesterday was my full day with my Comics Readers Advisory students, so we spent 7 hours together in the classroom, and that augments what we do weekly. And they also have some additional expectations for offline work. So it ends up being equivalent, I think, but it's not quite the same experience across both modalities. But what I would encourage you to do, first of all, is simply not to focus on the technology and instead focus on the students. The technology is a means to an end. So forget about it as much as you can at the beginning and think about what would I like to have my students accomplish, how do I want them to be different, and then figure out how you can make the technology work with you to accomplish that. So I want to spend a little bit of time going back to the agenda. I've come up with sort of 3 categories of practice that I engage in. So creating a supportive environment, encouraging engagement, and extending the classroom. And I want to start with creating a supportive environment. So we use Moodle as a course infrastructure for all of our courses. And is that what? Yeah, okay. All of our students, regardless of whether they're distance or on campus, expect at this point for there to be a Moodle space that's developed. For all of my students, but especially for my distance students, I feel that the Moodle is a substitute for the brick and mortar classroom. So it's very important for me to provide as much structure and as much content as I can from the very beginning of the semester. Because we're not always going to meet until maybe halfway through the semester, face to face. So I want them to come in and see what's possible. So typically how I organize my Moodle space, at the top, in addition to the information about the course, I put course documents, class forums, and I always have 2 in particular. One is a general or open discussion forum that stays there. I may have additional open discussion fora elsewhere in the Moodle, and then a questions space. And I try to encourage students at any point that they have questions about logistics, assignments, the progress of the class to post there, and that I don't have to be the only person to answer those questions. That I found is really important. I check the space every day. sometimes multiple times a day, and I have the questions sent directly to me via email, but there still may be people who beat me into that space and who can provide the answer. I go on and I put all of the spaces for class assignments, any additional resources I have, and then each week of the course looks something like this. So in the Moodle space, there's a question, and I have found that it's really useful for my students. It's useful for me as I plan my instruction to organize each week around questions instead of topics. It doesn't work for everyone, but it works for me. So I include my readings with links out. I'll talk about this class extension more in a bit, and then sometimes I'll have additional resources. It's also where I post my class notes and slides, which I try to do typically in at least an hour before class. Some students like to have those notes and slides printed out so that they can take their own notes on them as I teach. But sometimes they are not equivalent. Some of my classes are very heavily image-based, and Moodle does not support that very well. It's too cumbersome for people to download, so I usually have a PDF equivalent that strips out some of the images for that. So making the environment from the start a welcoming, supportive environment. During each class, there are two things I do. I always try to do. One is on my slides, I provide the agenda. Again, I think this provides the visual cue for what it is we're going to be talking about. I always had my agenda with the central question for the week. As a reminder, this is what we're going to be discussing and trying to work towards. I did the same thing in part for this presentation. I always begin each class with questions and comments. This is in part to build rapport, but this is so students can ask me questions if they have questions about the class. I share updates in terms of grading or events that I think they need to know about, that kind of thing. But I also invite students at the beginning of each class to share their experiences if they've been to conferences or professional development workshops. Anything like that is fair game. Sometimes, because I teach classes with a focus on young people in libraries, sometimes it's about a movie that they've seen that's relevant. Norma?
How long are your synchronous classes?
2 hours.
And how much time do you give to the first part of questions?
The questions and comments often doesn't go beyond 5 minutes. But sometimes, depending, it might go a little bit longer than that. This is also the time when I typically provide general class-based feedback on assignments instead of individual student feedback. And I also give some feedback on class extensions. And again, I'll explain more about that in a little bit. At the beginning of the semester, one of the things I want to do is to make sure students understand how the technology works, because I always have some students who this is not their first class using Illuminate and some that it is. So I want them to be confident and comfortable using the mic and reminding them that it's okay for them to speak in class, which is really uncomfortable for some folks, even more than in a face-to-face class. So I give written instructions on a mic check activity. And it's really low buy-in, just turn on your mic, I call on you, and you tell me your name and something else. But I find that gets people over this hurdle of, I don't know, I don't want to talk to these people I can't see, fear. I give similar sorts of instructions that I'll show in a minute the first couple of times I do small group activities, because I want people to understand the process and how the space works. Again, I think that just helps in making this environment friendly and supportive for learning. We have both voice chat capabilities, but we can also do text chat. And I have heard that some instructors in my department discourage text chat, or students just don't engage that way. I want them to. This is part of a transcript from one class for 2 minutes. This isn't even the full 2 minutes worth of text chat that came. So I typically have 20 to 25 or a few more students per class, and almost all of them are engaging in chat. It's not always on target, but they're responding to me, they're responding to classmates, and I'm careful to stop maybe every 5 to 10 minutes and take a quick look back and try to summarize, look for questions I might have missed, point out some key ideas that people have introduced. Occasionally I have a teaching assistant with me who can help monitor that, but I don't always. Yes, ma'am.
I'm asking you this question.
Sure.
After teaching 20 classes, so I'm not coming as a new
Right.
one. I'm really interested in this because I think I find that my students have two different strands of conversations, and that sometimes they're a little too confident about the fact that they can multitask and they can't.
Yes.
I love both conversations, and I'm comfortable doing both for the most part. But I am worried that those that are really good at chatting are no longer listening to those that have spent a lot of time on their presentations and are running critical questions and critical discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And so having invited engagement, half the class is actually engaging on something else.
Right.
I just put it out there. I don't want to interrupt it.
No.
I talk
Yeah.
about this. I certainly engage the problem, but it's a simple problem. It's an interesting problem.
So one of the things I find myself doing, I've gotten much better about my own multitasking and being able to pay attention to what I'm trying to say and monitor what's going on the text chat. But one of the things I do find myself doing occasionally is just saying, hey, stop for just a second. You all are way far off. You know, no one cares about whatever it is you're talking about right now. Let's come back to the topic at hand. And usually that works, and people realize that, you know, they just need a nudge back to whatever the topic of the class is. I don't mind some diversion. And I also do some check-ins regularly. So one of the other things I do, as I ask questions, I try to get instant feedback. So my strategy has always been just as a check-in that you're listening, that you type an exclamation point. And that just helps people realize that someone's still there talking and they need to be more attentive. So that's just a really fast way, I think, to make sure people are still alive. One of the things I still haven't gotten used to is the idea that people can, go wander off and maybe they really aren't there for the 2 hours. I don't think that happens very often, but I'm sure that it does from time to time. So the chat can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. I try to encourage engagement. I mentioned the check-ins just with typing a bang, but I also try to invoke regular questions that I put on my slides as moments to stop and reflect, and then I encourage people to share either in text chat or verbally. Sometimes those are more effective than others. I also try to think, how can I, again, replicate the kinds of activities I want to have in a face-to-face class in an online environment. And so one of the things, for instance, in my youth services class that we deal with is this issue of understanding what books might be appropriate, more appropriate than others for emerging readers. And so I can't hold up a bunch of books for folks to see, so I've found ways of bringing in scans or bringing in screenshots or other elements like that that provide us with talking points. And these are pages for folks to talk about. This is me prompting them to point out strengths and weaknesses for these kinds of texts. But we also have directed small group activities. And as I mentioned with the mic check earlier, the first 1 or 2 times I do activities at the beginning of each semester, I provide more structured guidance. So I create breakout rooms. I typically try to create breakout rooms that, this is kind of silly, but they're often named after something relevant to whatever we're studying that week. It's just another quick cue to bring people back. Remember that people can use their mics. Not everyone wants to, again, so there are often in the breakout rooms a mix of people text chatting and talking orally, and that's fine. They've found ways of making it work. Students have access to a whiteboard, and even getting them to be comfortable using that is difficult early on. I have in previous classes even put up a blank whiteboard and asked people just to, go type something. Type their name, type their favorite book, whatever it happens to be, to get them over that hump. And that I also use the whiteboard too, coming back to the sort of the disengaging in text chat. I will sometimes add in a blank whiteboard and ask people to post, anonymously a response to some provocative question. And so that's a way to get more engagement as well. I use a timer, which is something that Collaborate offers. It's a countdown timer, and I can always extend it, but it gives students a visual reminder wherever they are in the space, what needs to happen. I tend to give very explicit task definitions, again, early on. These will become more shorthanded as the semester progresses, but I want them to have a clear idea of what they're supposed to come away with. We may not have a report back from each group each time. It depends. I may ask Group A to report back on one particular element and not all of them. Sometimes I ask groups to summarize their ideas in writing and post them to the course space after the class, or to email them to me, and then I summarize or synthesize across the 4 or 5 groups, and that provides an opportunity for talking. One of the things I found really important is to make sure that these task instructions are also available in each of the breakout rooms, because even if the instructions are short, students sometimes don't have a very lengthy memory of what they're supposed to do. So if you put them in the breakout rooms, it can be a good reminder. Most of my activities in the youth services class that I teach at a distance are fairly structured. I also teach a course on comics readers advisory, which is about thinking about comics as information artifacts, understanding comics as a medium, and then figuring out ways of connecting readers of all ages with comics that they might enjoy. And each week we have a different set of readings that are all student selected, and I give them opportunities at the beginning of each class to go into small groups and talk and share with what they've read for the week, to allow them to build their repertoire of comics understanding. A lot of times I don't give them anything structured. This is just them talking for 10 or 15 minutes. But for some, I will do really simple kinds of activities on the whiteboard. So they'll still be talking about these more nebulous, overarching questions. But for instance, when we talk about nonfiction comics, I might put up a simple diagram, learned a little, learned a lot, loved, hated, and ask them to write the titles of their comics in the quadrant representing how they felt about them. And again, this is something that I would pull these whiteboards back into the main discussion room at the end of the 10 or 15 minutes, and everyone would have a chance to see what folks have been talking about. I am cognizant that students have different modes, different levels of interest in participating, that not all students are going to want to be engaged in the synchronous class session in the same way, that not all students want to be engaged in a face-to-face classroom in the same way. One of the things I do to supplement participation, to give students an option, is most weeks, not every week, but most weeks I have what I call a class extension, which takes whatever the topic is, gives people some more resources, and gives them a task or a response. It's usually very practically oriented, so it's getting them to think about think about a particular issue, so taking a look at a library's collection for young people, thinking about it in terms of users, evaluating it, that kind of thing. Looking at manuals. There is a forum then each week for people to post if they have done this. They can write their responses, they can email them to me if they don't want to share them publicly. But then as an instructor, I read these each week, I read the responses, and I provide some summaries, and these become talking points to use in that week's class. So I can call out students directly and bring their experiences in and help them feel more engaged. Norma?
The class extensions then are not for the whole class, only for those that miss the class? Or?
No, they're for anyone. So what I tell people is that I want them to come, be engaged and be active learners in the classroom. But if it's an off week, if they have to miss part of the class, or they're not feeling vocal, whatever it happens to be, and they want to demonstrate their engagement and participation, this is an option. But I find that a lot of students choose to do this even, yes.
And it doesn't happen every week?
These are almost every week. Usually the first week of the class and sometime around Thanksgiving break, I don't post class extensions. Yes, sir.
Do you give out extra credits for this?
No. But if you have had an attendance issue, if you've been quiet throughout the semester in the synchronous sessions, whatever, this would certainly help move your participation grade up. So, yes, sir.
You may have told us before, but what class sizes are you?
This is about 25 students.
Do you have TA support?
Not always. Not always. When I was at Indiana teaching, I had class sizes anywhere from 30 to 65 students with no TA support. So this is a breeze comparatively. I don't say that very many places because I don't want 65 students again. But these are just short responses. I also try to provide students with multiple opportunities and multiple modalities for contact. So some students want to call me on the phone, that's great. I'm happy to do that. But I also schedule online office hours if I need to. I'm available through Twitter or Google Chat or other kinds of avenues if students want to engage with me that way. I've also found that there have been some instances where I've had to be gone for a conference, or I've been out sick or something, and I've had to rethink what I'm going to do online that week because I don't have a voice or I don't have an internet connection that will support this. Sometimes what I just end up doing is holding an open office hours a couple of times in lieu of class where students can come and we can just talk. And I tend to have really good response rates on that when that is the case. Usually this is like a once a year thing that happens when I lose my voice. And so I usually have about 2/3 to 3/4 of the students show up for one of these time slots, and they're eager to be part of that. I try to have some little rituals to make the class, again, more inviting and more engaging, to mark it as a class. So one of the things I used to do that's harder to support, I used to play music prior to class for about 15 minutes. And it was always music that was themed for the week. That's really fun to do for the comics class. It's harder to do for the youth services class, but I can make it work. With the new Collaborate system, that's been made incredibly difficult because there's no good way to stream that audio to everyone. So I've switched. And I now post links to typically 3 or 4 YouTube videos. Again, that are themed with the class that day. And I find that a lot of students then start coming earlier and earlier and earlier to log in, so they have time to watch the video. So it's a way to get them more excited about the beginning of class and make it fun. Another ritual I have is always posting some sort of comic or cartoon as the final slide. And that may, again, seem really simple or silly, but it's something that students begin to look forward to. And that's not necessarily active learning, but it still invites a sense of engagement and interest. And I think it helps extend the classroom. And then finally, the necessity of flexibility. How many of you have had things go horribly wrong in a distance class? I have shown up in my classes, and when we were doing interactive video at Indiana, I did some radio classes because there was no video capability for the night, or the connections would drop 19 times in 3 hours. Here with Illuminate and Collaborate, I have what I call robo-carol that happens for some reason almost an hour into every synchronous class, which is my connection, whether I'm in my office or at my house or somewhere else. My voice streaming slows down so much that my students just start saying, "Oh, robo-carol's here." So I have to log out and do an audio check again and log back in. And that's a little ritual of sorts that has become humorous. It's like robo-carol's back. I have to wait for students to tell me that. And there will be other issues. So I just find that the flexibility is key, and being upfront and honest with students that things may fail badly, spectacularly. For the course that day, that you're trying something new, you're not sure if it's going to work, or there are storms coming through and you don't know that your connection is going to hold, whatever it is. I try to model for them that I am taking chances and taking risks too, because something that's really important for me is to help students understand that the classroom is their safe place to take risks before they go out in profession, and I want to model that for them. So I will leave it at this, and I chose this cartoon. This is an XKCD cartoon, because certainly teaching online, teaching at a distance is a process. You can't fix it all in one night. You might be motivated after you finish teaching one night either to go drink a bottle of wine or stay up all night trying to make it better. So it just takes time and practice. And thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And I'm using the mic for the recording. It's not that I like the mic. But if we have questions, I have to pass the mic.
Okay. This may be an unfair question, given all the good content that you shared with us. But to what degree is your approach scalable? A lot of the discussion in our college has sort of centered around the question that the model of active learning that you presented is certainly student-centered, and it's nice, but in a way it still mirrors too much from an economic point of view or scalable whole. It still mirrors what we do in a regular classroom. So in a sense, it is not online learning, but perhaps a hybrid learning where we just move the interaction that we'd have in a classroom to an online, and people don't have to attend. What's your sense of scalability of an active learning approach synchronously that you've presented?
So I think the kind of model I'm presenting is workable up to, say, 40 to 50 students in a class setting. I think beyond that it becomes not so much active as chaotic. I think with online-only classes, which I've taught, so asynchronous web-based courses, you can still include elements of active learning in those quite nicely, and I've had 50 to 100 students enrolled in some of those. So it depends, but I agree, this is not something you can do with a lecture course of 200 students, or even a class of 30 undergrads. I think undergraduate education is probably a little different beast. I started out in life as a high school teacher, but I don't have undergrad teaching experience. I think this works well for grad students because they tend to be a little bit more self-motivated, that kind of thing. But it might not fit for undergrads.
I guess I want to take Peter's question and go in a slightly different direction. This seems to me highly scaffolded. Mm-hmm. So when I think about an engaged classroom, it's students setting the agenda, it's students doing the reading, mm-hmm. leading the discussion, bringing in the critical questions and responding to one another. And I'm thinking about one of my colleagues who scaled that up in a way that I don't even do. I mean, I'm setting the assignments, but the students run the class.
Right.
His is much more lateral, and what I take to be really radical engagement, which is it's peer-to-peer group all the way. And they may meet for consultation about how their projects are going, but it's really their show. Mm-hmm. To me, you're on the more structured end of what I might think of as engagement.
I am. Guilty as charged. I would love to do a class like you're describing. I think if I had an opportunity to do a 10 or 12 person seminar style class. Okay. I'm not that brave. Yeah, I'm not that brave. I would love to try something like that with a smaller group of students. I've changed how I structure courses over time. I think primarily in response to students. So when I have done more student-driven learning activities and student-driven course structures, the students I teach tend to freak out. And so I have backed off of some of that, and I've gone back to some of the more instructor-driven.
Why they freak out? I just curious.
I think it's interesting. I don't know whether it's there's a certain contingent of students actually that freaks out the most, and it's the students who are practicing K-12 educators who are coming back to get their MLS, who are getting their school librarianship endorsement. And I think they have had particular pedagogical experiences as learners. It's not how they work in their own classrooms, and they just don't like it. That they make up about a third of the students that I have. I have also found, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, that with students who are coming into our program straight out of undergrad without any kind of work experience actually need a lot more hand-holding than others. And so sort of that dual impact has made a difference.
Have you ever taught a class without a synchronous session in it?
Yes.
And how did it work compared to to our synchronous sessions?
So the class that I taught wholly as an asynchronous web-based course was a grant writing course that did have a lot of peer feedback involved in it. But because it was such a writing-intensive class, a writing and research-intensive class, I think that functioned okay. I don't think it would work very well for a lot of other courses. It becomes too much like a correspondence class, which is good for some things.
We are out of time for your presentation, but I have a last question, and so since I have the mic, I'm going to use it to ask the question. How different is your face-to-face class to your online class?
So I think what happens with the face-to-face class, I actually use very similar slide decks. So the students see mostly the same content. What happens with the face-to-face class I think I mentioned at the beginning, our online sessions are 2 hours, our face-to-face classes meet for 2 hours and 50 minutes. And so what happens is that 50 minutes is used for discussion and activities, and discussion is happening all the time in the synchronous online classes. So I think we're getting the same degree of discussion in the synchronous session that we do in the face-to-face. It's just that it's happening simultaneously in the synchronous session, and we need time beyond that in the face-to-face class. But I also have more opportunities for different kinds of group activities and show and tell sorts of things that aren't as easily accomplished in an online setting.
Let's thank you, Carol, for sharing her experience, and this, if we'll be happy to have her if she wants to stay a little more. The idea of this workshop is to reflect on our own practices, and as I said at the beginning, we have 2 questions on one side of the sheet and a few questions in the back of the sheet that we would like you to think, and we're going to discuss them. The idea is that you think about those, write a few words under the question so that then we can collect these papers and see what people are thinking, but you're also going to share with the rest of us your thoughts on how your reflection, how you do it. And if you haven't done any synchronous teaching before, you can skip question 1. But I will, in a few minutes, I will come back and ask you to share your thoughts with the person that you have next to you. Well, we're having a very interesting discussion, and I give you 2 seconds to finish your conversation. And you're done? We're going to now. It was very interesting to hear what things from Carol's experience, how it compares to our own experience, and what things we can apply or we hadn't thought about. And I would like that every group tells us a little bit of their conversation. I will start with my group, and we were 3 in the group, and we were talking about we found the rituals an interesting way to start and end, and I like the idea. I don't remember your name. Allison. Allison had a good idea that she says she would like to start or to end with something Illini, like the marching Illini, or something that would bring them to campus, like a little bit of campus life. I thought that was a good idea. Do you want to share some of your thoughts or a highlight?
Oh, from what we talked about?
From your discussion, yes.
Well, we found a lot of really helpful and useful ideas. We both did like the rituals and having that something consistent, and thinking about Moodle as a canvas and not just we have to do it in this way, but you can move things around. So that was liberating. It's like we knew it, but we didn't know it. So thank you for that.
It's the same. Do you want to say something else?
I want to ask Tilley.
You want to ask?
Yeah, Carol. Yeah.
Yes.
It's on. Okay. Just now we discussed. Yeah, we like this. What you have presented very much, but unfortunately, we don't have such experience of online teaching. I especially like the way you mentioned about engagement of students. By providing music, videos, and whatever, and the students can come earlier than before. Another way is the modality of exchanging ideas with students or answering students' questions. And since I don't have such experience, I'll ask maybe a very silly question. That is, does you appear on the screen?
I typically don't. So we do have the option with Collaborate to do video chat as well. But I typically only do the audio version during the first night of class, I will come on with the videos so people know that there's a real person talking to them, and give them a little tour of my office, whatever. And then occasionally I might put the video back on at some other point during the semester, but it's usually just the audio version of me.
Share something or pass it?
Julie?
Well, I had the privilege to ask questions. I was mostly interested in an active learning, an active pedagogy should spawn a lot of ideas. So there could be a lot of diversion, and the question was how do you bring them back together, and also how many voices are actually lost. For an instructor who just talks to himself, this is not a problem. And yeah, I mean, you told me you would. If voices are lost, you would allow them to send you documents. But necessarily, the active pedagogy is the good thing is that people get inspired, but they also go off into all kind of directions. So in online learning, that is probably particularly complicated.
Any ideas of something that you will apply in a synchronous session that you hadn't thought of?
I like, the ritual as well. It's a question of presence, really. I like that. That's good. I mean, you make yourself present. I never thought about that before. And I think I will have to think about much more how to deal with the depth versus breadth issue, essentially. I normally solve that with an electronic whiteboard a lot, but that's just one way. Yeah, I'm thinking more about different ways, different artifacts. Like I like the grid, for example, that people can express themselves very quickly. So they continue to collaborate. Yeah, so that was a good example. Yeah.
I think the class reflection or the class extension, the class reflection or extension activities in some ways help get at more depth if students choose to do those, because it's a way, I hope, for people to synthesize the readings, their experiences. They don't have to do it before class, so they could ostensibly do it after we've had lecture, but then it gives them an opportunity to think about those topics and ideas more deeply.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all for participating in this session. And we will collect your reflections, if you don't mind, and we will share with you by email the PDF, the handout of her presentation, and we will also share a summary of what we learned from you in these handouts.